IKIM FM, inspirasi utama anda. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And a very good afternoon to our dear listeners of IKIM FM. Welcome to this special interview. I'm Batisha Afrina. Alhamdulillah. Thank you very much for listening to us from wherever you are. Either you are listening to this through radio or even through our social media pages, Facebook and YouTube. And today I'm co-hosting with Nawar Anissa as we speak with Professor Khaled Beydoun, who is a renowned law professor, author and also a prominent activist on Islamophobia and civil liberties. So this episode is actually the second part of our conversation on rebel or radical, the dual narratives of terrorism and freedom fighting. So if you missed the first part, you can find it on our social media platforms, including Facebook and YouTube. So without further ado, let's dive into the second part of the interview.
Many Western nations that have supported, it's going back to the terrorist term here, that many Western nations have supported groups that were once labeled as terrorists when it suited their geopolitical interests. Exactly.
Yeah.
And like, for example, like the Afghan Mujahideen, right? Afghan Mujahideen during the Cold War. And this complicates, I think, the consistency of the label terrorist itself. So how do you reconcile the selective application of the term terrorist when it serves the geopolitical interests? And what does this say about the neutrality of such labels?
Well, you know, I think you framed it in the way one should answer it, is that the term terrorist doesn't actually mean anything intrinsically. It actually has a definition. You know, what terrorism actually means is you break it down to a couple of elements, right? So it's basically mass violence that is motivated by some political ideology.
So it's like politically construct?
It's not politically it's like every sort of like legal term of art. It is comprised of specific elements that are racially and religiously neutral. So the term terrorism as a legal term is not specifically tied to any one race or religion. Let me give you an example. So state-sponsored terrorism. What Israel is doing right now, I would qualify as state-sponsored terrorism because it meets both elements. Number one, driven by a specific political ideology. Unhinged Zionism, this vision of greater Israel, that is the ideology. It is inflicting mass violence, you know, killing, maiming, destroying, decimating, on behalf of furthering that political ideology. That meets the technical definition of terrorism, right?
Yeah.
From an objective, neutral standpoint. But back to your observation, the United States has selectively used that term in ways that align or misalign with its interests. And the example you raise is a good one. In the 1980s, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan were our friends because they were fighting against our enemy who were the Soviet Union, right? So we're not going to call them terrorists because they're helping us. Same as Saddam Hussein in the 80s was an ally of the United States. We all know that, right? Especially the young people may not know that, but some of us more seasoned, we know that.
And then since the Kurdish were once set aside because it's not going to be any of interest to us.
Exactly.
Yes.
So, exactly. Elements who are of no interest to us, we kind of leave them alone.
Yes.
But the Mujahideen become the Taliban, right?
Yeah.
Same entity, essentially, but they become terrorists because they're no longer useful to American interests. Why are they no longer useful to American interests? Because the Soviet Union has fallen.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
Now the Taliban are basically tethered to Al-Qaeda post 9/11.
Yeah.
So we got to destroy them, even though they were once our enemies.
It's become like just political tool for them.
Exactly. So the term terrorism is exactly that's what it is. It's a political tool.
But how is it that, in what way that the media double standards in the West shapes and the narratives of Islam and terrorism, the double standard of the media?
Oh, very much so. In two ways, right? The primary way is that up until recently, as a consequence of the advent and emergence of social media, Western audiences, specifically American audiences, only saw, only perceived Arab and Muslims through the lens of terrorism, right? In news media, in film. If you were to, there's a great book by a scholar named, two books actually, Jack Shaheen, called Real Bad Arabs. He surveys Hollywood film and television and basically comes out with the conclusion that the vast majority of these films and television shows fixate on Arabs and Muslims only through the lens of violence and terrorism and barbarism. Another book by a scholar named Evelyn El-Sultani. She writes about the post 9/11 era, all film and cinema only fixating on Arabs and Muslims through this lens of terrorism. So it's news media and soft media that only basically is conveying Muslims through this lens of terrorism.
And I would like to go a little bit personal because you mentioned of the
Sure.
911 here, because you as Muslims who live in the US, actually during that, I would say post 9/11, of course, I believe you personally experienced the impact from the Islamophobia. So can you share with us how deeply it's impacted you and also your family?
You know, in many ways, I think for me, the best way it's impacted me is like, look, I'm an American. You know, for better or for worse, I'm proud of being an American in some regards. There's a lot of beauty to the United States, diversity, the values that are embedded in the Constitution, the idea that you can be an immigrant. You know, my parents came as immigrants. We didn't have many. We don't have much growing up, but I grew up and became a law professor. So there is opportunity in the United States. There's good, and I think it's important for us to acknowledge and see that good. There's also a lot of bad. So 9/11 changed me
A lot.
considerably, right? Because before 9/11, I was a college kid who loved sports and, you know, thought about the idea of going to law school to be a sports agent. You know, I was always an activist, but after 9/11, I just knew that I had to dedicate my life to combating and really, you know, grappling with this new sort of leviathan of Islamophobia that was emerging. So intellectually, it really defined the trajectory for the remainder of my life after that. The way it affected us imminently is I come from a very concentrated Arab and Muslim American community in the state of Michigan. So Detroit, exactly. So in Detroit, you know, it was common occurrence of hate crimes, hate incidents, you know, women who wore hijab being afraid to shop by themselves, having the hijab torn off their heads, children assimilating, you know, changing their names because they feared negative response. This is very common. So you'd find like young men named Muhammad who are changing their names to Mike. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Or-
Americanize their name.
And Americanizing their identities.
Mo. Muhammad's Mo.
I wrote an article called Acting Muslim, right? And what you saw after 9/11, but also after the rise of Trump, is Muslims began to conceal their Muslim identity because they felt as if they needed to do that to stave off suspicion, but also to advance themselves in American society.
They feel like they need to assimilate with the societies around them.
I was always a rebel, so for me, I was always unapologetic of being Arab and Muslim.
Interesting, because a rebel typically refers to someone who resists the authority, but in certain situations it can change. So you're not a radical; it's just rebel.
I would say I'm a radical and a rebel. I like to resist authority. I mean, part of the reason why I went to law school and became a law professor is I wanted to sort of unearth and unveil the hypocrisy in Western law. And if they choose to call me a radical, then so be it.
Then so be it.
Yeah.
And talking about law, I just like to touch a bit on things that happened between the late last year and I would say between late last year and early this year about the South Africa that they initiated the legal proceedings against Israel at the International Court of Justice, ICJ, and they accused of the Israel of violating the Genocide Convention through its action in Gaza. And this has successfully brought significant global attention to Israel's actions toward Palestinians. And of course, we know that ICJ has issued provisional measures directing Israel to prevent acts of genocide.
Yeah, directly.
And also allow humanitarian aid. And in your perspective, now we know that the current situation that Israel's they're being aggressive in attacking Lebanon, reflecting back into this, how might the outcome of the case affect international human rights law and the enforcement of the Genocide Convention? Because it feels like for the Israel, it seems like they're not scared at all. Because so what if you are really guilty? So what's your thought on that?
Right. So if you have the global superpower essentially enabling you and emboldening you to do whatever it is you want, essentially view yourself to be above the law. Even though, what does the United States say? That we are a nation of laws, that we uphold the rule of law, that the very, look, I wrote this post on Instagram 3 days after the genocide that I think that became the thesis for what's going on in the world today moving ahead. I wrote that the genocide in Gaza unveiled the myth of Western democracy and civilization, right? Because what does it mean? What does it mean if the United Nations, the ICJ, the ICC, which are essentially the institutions which are tasked by the West, mind you, to uphold human rights and the rule of law internationally, if they're not abiding by it?
Exactly.
What is it saying about them? So in many respects, I think that this is a moment of reckoning for the West, Israel and the United States and much of Western Europe, to look in the mirror and see that they are not the civilized bastions that they believe they themselves to be. That they are in very respects, using law as a blunt weapon to advance their interests. In Israel, in many respects, you guys know Dr. Frankenstein?
Dr. Frankenstein.
The doctor who makes this.
Yeah, the
Frankenstein.
Yes.
Israel is the Frankenstein of the United States.
What is a Jekyll in Frankenstein?
It's made this monster that essentially is doing whatever it is it wants to do, violating every human rights law. In South Africa, I think the when they filed a petition in the ICJ, it was a very powerful moment, right? Because we all know the history of South Africa. We know that they overcame apartheid.
Yes.
Right? So symbolically, it was very powerful for South Africa to champion that case. And not only that, but the founding fathers of modern South Africa, people like Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela were... Desmond Tutu called apartheid in Palestine worse than in South Africa.
Yes.
Nelson Mandela, before he passed away, and mind you, the United States classified Nelson Mandela as a terrorist up until 2008.
Yes.
He was on the terror list in the United States. He said that our freedom isn't complete without the freedom of the Palestinian people. Right? So what does it mean if we get a positive ruling out of the ICJ? It means little practically if the United States is not keen on enforcing that ruling and is emboldening Israel at every step. But symbolically, it's powerful because what's happening right now in real time is that Israel is becoming a pariah state globally.
Yeah, it is.
Right? People can see what's happening.
Yes, people can.
Right? The court of popular opinion, globally speaking, knows that this is a genocide, regardless of what the ICJ says or doesn't say.
So do you agree that U.S. supports toward Israel itself, it is like I would say damaging to their reputation, as I would say, because U.S. used to be looked upon as the land of democracy, but now that they're supporting Israel.
And you mentioned as well earlier, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the beauty of the Constitution, being an American, so we know, globally we know about it. So it's
damaging. It's damaging the reputation.
It's damaging the reputation on its own.
It's kind of like, you guys like shopping?
Yeah.
Who doesn't?
Okay. So you go to a store, Zara. You guys have Zara here?
Yeah.
Zara, the dress looks really nice when you're watching it, looking at it. It looks nice on the rack. But once you wear it a couple of times, it falls apart.
Yes.
That is what U.S. democracy looks like. It looks nice, right? From afar, on paper, sitting at the rack. Exactly. But it comes apart when you actually identify and interrogate the inconsistencies and hypocrisies in the cheap way in which it has been manufactured, right? Look at American history, right? It's built upon genocide. It's built on manifest destiny. It's built upon the enslavement of African peoples, right? In the United States, you couldn't become a naturalized citizen unless you were white until 1952. So there's the beauty on the paper of the American Constitution that is entirely dissonant and disconnected from the reality of the American experience.
So it's just a facade.
It's a facade.
I wouldn't say it's entirely a facade. Again, going back to what I said initially, there is a lot of redeeming and beautiful aspects of American life. But if it's a facade in ways, look, I'll put it for you plainly. If something aligns with American governmental interests,
support.
The U.S. will support it. If it's not aligned with American interests, then that is when it becomes a facade.
And if you remember, I think of 2 months ago, if not, about the incident killing of the Southport stabbing. And I think it's another classic example of how vulnerable Muslim communities are to be blamed when there's an incident involving mass killing or public violence in Western societies. And the global community has a responsibility to challenge these harmful narratives by the Western that link Islam with terrorism. So can you share with us how can the global community, or even the countries from the South, for example, how can they oppose to this perspective?
It's a good question. So I'll sort of cite a recent example for you, right? So the president of Colombia, who's been in my opinion, a vocal champion since the beginning of this genocide, a couple of days ago, he said that the killing of Palestinian people is also anti-Semitic.
Yes.
So, and because Palestinians, Lebanese, people from that region of the world are a Semitic people.
Yes.
But that term has been essentially narrowed and appropriated to only mean Jewish people.
Jewish people.
Jews are also Semitic.
They are.
Right? Jews are also, many Jews are also indigenous to that land as well.
Yes.
Let's be real, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think the way in which we fight it Look, in the beginning of this genocide, a lot of Western media outlets, including outlets like Piers Morgan, CNN, BBC, would invite me on their shows. I always said no, right? Because one thing we cannot do is to have these conversations on their terms. We cannot debate and argue on their terms. We cannot take face value who they qualify and classify as terrorist organizations and how they define as terror organizations. The way we fight and support Muslims globally is to basically, again, I think craft our own histories, craft our own media narratives, have debates and discussions on equal terms, not our terms, on equal terms.
On equal terms,
right? Let's be honest, right? So there are bad Muslim actors,
Yes.
right? We're not going to side with somebody just because they're Muslims. There's a number of Muslim individuals and Muslim organizations that do wrong.
Yes.
And the essence of Islam is to always stand with haqq.
Yes.
Right? And the essence of Islam is the same as the essence of democracy and liberty. You stand with haqq. Right? So I think that's what we need to do and what we have to peddle globally. And for me, Islamophobia is so redemptive because for the first time, it's essentially saying that we cannot just view Muslims as being terrorists and villains. We also have to view Muslims as being victims as well of this grand war on terror.
It is. Like since mentioned earlier about the Christchurch mosque attack, and things like that's what the Muslim society, not in Asia, because I think Alhamdulillah we're pretty strong here, especially in Malaysia and Indonesia.
So you are the dominant.
Yeah, we're quite
To the
dominant.
majority.
To the majority here, but in countries such as Australia, New Zealand, things are pretty tough, and they've been trying to say that, look, because of this narrative from the other side of the West have been saying that Muslims equals to terrorism, and we have to take care and go after them. But I think in other terms as well that, hey, look, we are being attacked here too. But it's just that sometimes people don't see it that way. So I have a slightly
Not only the West though. Let me just. So we're not far from Myanmar.
Oh yes.
And we've seen what happened with Rohingya.
Yes.
Right, the ethnic cleansing of Rohingya.
Yeah.
We're not far from India. In in my opinion, Islamophobia in India is
strong.
one of the worst in the world.
Yes, it's so rampant.
We're not far from China, and look at the
Uyghurs.
persecution and genocide of Uyghur Muslims
Yes.
as well. So, and that's another sort of contribution I make in this book, is to say that Islamophobia is not only a Western phenomenon, right? It's unfolding in various parts of the world
Globally.
as well. Exactly.
So this question is something that I've been wanting to ask you. Some people have not heard of Mahmoud Darwish.
Yeah.
But in your own word, who is he to you, and why is he so inspirational to you, Khaled?
So Mahmoud Darwish is one of my intellectual heroes, who's a Palestinian poet and writer who wrote not only very defiantly but very beautifully about the Palestinian cause, struggle and resistance. Right, and many of his, I've been rereading many of his works during the thick of his genocide. My father, Allah yarhamuhu, who passed away in 2016, was a big fan of Mahmoud Darwish. So some of my earliest memories as a child growing up in Lebanon
was listening to his works.
Or seeing his books at our dinner table, and seeing my father read the poems. And like let me share one of his most beautiful quotes. Is he writes, Mahmoud Darwish, "If you live free, or die standing like the trees." Right. So this beautiful courage that rises from his work is very relevant today. Here's another beautiful poem about Gaza called Silence in Gaza, which I'd recommend everybody read.
Silence in Gaza.
Yeah.
This is interesting. One of those I don't know if I can mention this previous interview or show of Anthony Bourdain when he was in Gaza. A guy actually said that, "Oh no, we're not scared, we will come back." And he didn't stop there. He actually did say, "If it's not me, it will be my kids, my grandchildren." And then I was telling my friends that, "Oh, okay, this is what they mean. It's not if it's not in our time, victory is upon us." So these are the kind of things that, since remember we mentioned earlier that it's coming to 7th October when some people are getting demotivated and tired and over this. So watching people saying things like this is very, it shows that we have a cause to uphold actually.
And it's very important to keep up with
the momentum.
And it's not uniquely Palestinian. I mean, if you I was speaking to my cousins in Lebanon. I'm like, "Are you afraid?" This is 24 hours ago. As soon as I landed here in Malaysia, calling my cousins, calling my friends, and there is no fear, right? Because once you have faith, and once you know that you are native to a land, right? Then you are essentially basically submitting yourself to the struggle of a righteous resistance. So this fearlessness is not only, and we see it. I mean, one. If you guys have young viewers, I tell my students all the time, there's one film that everybody should watch. It's called The Battle of Algiers.
Okay.
And it just shows how a people who love their land so much, who are inspired by God, will not fear an occupying force, and they eventually defeat it. Occupation is eventually going to be defeated in Gaza. It's going to be defeated in the West Bank. It's only a matter of time. And it's only a matter of when I think Israelis look themselves in the mirror and realize that what they're doing is horrific and vile and evil and sustainable, that they're putting their own children in danger. There's another, I'm sorry if I'm speaking too much, academics, we can talk a lot. There's a wonderful post-colonial scholar by the name of Aim Cesar. He wrote a treatise called On Colonialism, and for him he says that the colonizer brutalizes himself when he carries forward genocide, ethnic cleansing, and occupation. Right? There's an existential sort of self-sacrifice that takes place with this process, and we can see that happening in real time with Israel right now.
What about the link between Edward Said, Orientalism, and the present-day Islamophobia?
So Orientalism is the mother discourse for Orientalism. It is basically the bedrock epistemology that helps us understand and helps us frame and helped me frame how I thought about Islamophobia. There's a scholar by the name of Letty Volpe. She wrote a really prominent article in 2002 called The Citizen and the Terrorist, where she said that 9/11 led to the redeployment of Orientalist tropes. And Orientalist tropes are the idea that the Muslim world is this antithetical civilization that is of lesser value, of lesser esteem, barbaric, backwards, not civilized, while the West is everything but the positive mirror image. So after 9/11, we see these Orientalist tropes being readapted and redeployed in the new language of Islamophobia.
And if you look at the bigger discourse of discussion of the Islamophobia, the issue of Islamophobia is not, I would say, a recent. It's not a novel thing, because it's happening for years. Because if you look at in terms of the history, right, where, for example, like the Byzantine institution, they were threatened by the expansion of Islamic society throughout the region on that time, where you can see the expansion of the rise of the Ottoman Empire. There's been like hundreds or if not thousands of years. But now that, how do you think that the discussion, now that we have more
2024.
In 2024, in the 21st century.
Yes.
Do you think it's becoming better or actually it's becoming worse?
Is it becoming better or is it becoming worse? That's a hard question to ask. And again, I don't think in those terms. I think for me, it's becoming more clairvoyant is the better way to assess it. Look, 20 years from now, or 20 years ago, there was a war in Iraq. Anywhere from 1 million to 2 million people were killed in Iraq. One might venture to say that what happened in Iraq was far more brutal, far more tragic, far more deadly than what we're seeing right now in Gaza. That is very much based on the raw number of individuals killed during the course of that war, right?
It's just that we were not able to view it
we
in
couldn't
real
see
time.
it.
Yes.
Yeah, there was no social media. There were no
Yes.
individuals on the ground who had cell phones, right?
Exactly.
We might say if that was the case that was a genocide. We don't use the language of genocide or ethnic cleansing to talk about Iraq. But if we saw what was happening, maybe we would call it a genocide.
Yeah.
So is it getting better or worse? I don't know, but I think that we are better equipped with information that we didn't have before that makes us able to respond in ways that we couldn't before. Even in back to the discussion of media, right? For back in the day with regard to legacy or mainstream media, if you want to critique or write an article or share a perspective, you had to write an article and somebody within the editing board of the newspaper had to say yes or no.
Heavy
right?
edited.
Heavy editing, right?
Yeah.
Or if you go on a television show, they're going to edit you.
Yeah.
Or if they know that, hey, we're going to bring Khaled Beydoun on, he's going to say X, Y, and Z, we're not going to invite him on. Now you don't have to do that anymore, right? You can just build a following and say what it is you want to say and impact public opinion.
We could send you an email and Khalid, we need you here right now. And then you will be here talking about this.
Now we have the street journalism.
Yes.
Citizen journalism.
Citizen journalism, yes.
Exactly. Or digital citizenship. Yeah. Revolutionizing things in a range of ways. So it's not better or worse. It's the fact that it's more, one might even say more transparent and democratic.
Yeah.
And as we are reaching the end of this conversation, I would say, what's your last advice?
Yeah, my advice is like, look, significant change doesn't happen overnight, right? So even beyond looking at the activism you engage in within the lens of, can I change something? Can I not change something? Oftentimes we should do the right thing because it's the right thing, right? Especially as Muslims, right? We do it because it's the right thing regardless of what the outcome is. We know as Muslims the outcome is in Allah's hands, right? So instead of assessing things based on will things change or not change, we should do it because it's right. In addition to that, we are privileged, right? The fact that we live in safety, whether it's you living here in Malaysia, we have the opportunity to speak freely, to post, to go home and see our loved ones, to have water and food and shelter above our heads. Allah gives us, and me in the United States, Allah gives us these privileges, right?
Yes.
But with these privileges come responsibilities. And that if we don't act on that responsibility, we are essentially contributing to the status quo.
And with that being said, I would like to thank Khaled Beydoun for his insight on today's topic, rebel or radical, the dual narratives of terrorism and freedom fighting. And we hope that today's discussion can give you insights and give you an awareness about the issue, like how complex it is. It's not just, but then we believe that eventually that we will reach the end of the destination that we are aiming for. And again, I would like to thank Professor Khaled Beydoun for his insight. Assalamualaikum.
Waalaikumsalam.